was the devaluation of women's sports. I'm really late to the game here, but I did want to talk about this. There has been, I believe the NCAA championships in March. March Madness was being held in Georgia. A young woman posted that, that the women's sports teams were being devalued because they received much less space than the men's teams, and the facilities that they got weren't as nice, and the supplies they got weren't as either weren't as nice or weren't as functional as the men's ones. Either way, there were significant differences between what the men's teams had and what the women's teams had. And, the complaint was this was sexist, and sexism's ingrained in the system. And by the way, all that's true in a sense. And the NCAA did come out and apologize, but they made excuses. And then those excuses, like, we didn't have enough space, and that was proven wrong. It was a whole thing. But I'm sure you already know this because I'm very behind on this story. But I did want to talk about it because I wanted to talk about the intersections between feminism and socialism and sexism and capitalism. So what I mean by this is if you think about it a little more, it's true that there is sexism in the system. However, I'd like to point out that part of the sexism is us, as a whole, right? When we turn on sports, do we typically go to women's sports? I don't watch really any sports, but the question still stands, right? If you go to turn on a sport, basketball, tennis, soccer, whatever, or football for our European fans, if there are any, what teams are you going to watch? Oftentimes, it's those men's teams. So what happens? Our eyeballs become fixated to the men's sports. So the advertisers see that there are more eyeballs on the men's sports, so they spend their money to advertise there. And that advertising creates deals for the players, who can, get merch and get wealthy, and then translates for all these other things. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make here is capital is going where we're going because we, as a population, have devalued women's sports to be less than men's sports by directing our eyeballs. Now, while it's true that some of that is historical, as in women's sports were disadvantaged beforehand, but all that is sexism being reinforced with capitalism, being reinforced with more sexism. So it's a vicious cycle that cycles downwards. And in the end of the day, you get these terrible disparities like we saw earlier this year, just last month, with the women's team not having appropriate facilities that the men's teams had. So where does socialism and feminism come into this? Obviously, feminism at its most basic, obviously there are lots of different types of feminism, but the very base feminism is, making sure that women have equal opportunities as men. And that women are treated fairly and equally to men in all circumstances, right? So we need to use feminism to create an equal playing field, no puns intended, between men's sports and women's sports. We can create a culture in which we can reinforce the capitalist forces to give more value to women's sports. Or we could take a socialist approach, which is not to try and change our culture to reinforce capitalism, which will reinforce the culture and yada yada. A socialist approach is to make all of it valued by the sense that that all of the players are workers, men and female, and the approach we give to them is to be able to run their own leagues and to find their own sponsorships and things like that, as opposed to being it done from the outside, right? In a socialist culture, these teams will decide who they want to work with. And there are good feminist organizations out there, and I'm sure there are even companies who believe that women are an important part of the market that they can, solicit consumer goods to. So you take that you take that kind of that restructuring of our culture from a capitalist one to a socialist one, and because socialism is about creating equality, about democratization of workspaces and living spaces, you create an equal playing field, again, no puns intended, between women's sports and men's sports, because they're valued the same by society, because society sees them just as workers. And this isn't a class reductionist argument, by the way. This is an intersection between feminism, whose purpose primarily is to equate the sexes, that's an old way of thinking, to equate men and women, and socialism, which is to equate all workers, right? So we have this opportunity here to think about it from a more, for a high-level political, cultural perspective. But in the meantime, what we can do to help women's sports now is just watch them more. Because again, until we can overthrow this capitalist system, the money is simply going to go where the eyeballs are. The sexism in advertising, the sexism in media is just a reflection of the sexism in our society that we all hold collectively. So whether you are a sexist or not, or what have you, if you are going to watch a sport next time, turn into a women's sport. Because the more eyeballs we can put on this, the more the capitalist forces that control where the money goes, where the resources go, they're going to follow them too. It's not a perfect solution, and obviously the perfect solution would just be to get rid of this system that reinforces the sexism and to create true equality. But until we do that, we need to play on these capitalist forces and trick them into doing the right thing. And I hope that, if more people tune in, we will not see a repeat of the type of blatant sexism and unfair distribution of resources that we saw in NCAA March Madness, which I'm sure, by the way, is reflected in other sports that are just less prominent and we don't see as much.